As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Yeah, I think the first thing people should be mindful of is there's a difference between Hinduism and Hindutva. Hinduism is the religion which 80% of the population subscribes to. Hindutva is the use of Hinduism as a political vehicle for a political ideology, which is essentially to create a monolithic, monochromatic society of Hindus only, primarily. And suggestions to that, you're looking at the rewriting of history textbooks, where they're just eliminating huge chunks of history.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to another episode of the Security Nexus Webinar, where we explore the most pressing security challenges and geopolitical shifts shaping the Indo-Pacific region and the world today. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel United States Army retired and professor here at DKI APCSS. It's a pleasure to have you with us for this insightful conversation in episode 20, India's Security Outlook in Modi's third term. India, emerging from British colonial rule in 1947 as the world's largest democracy, has become a major global player economically and strategically. The country's political landscape took a decisive turn in 2014 when Narendra Modi, a leader from the right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, was elected Prime Minister, coming into office with promises of reform and revitalization. Modi sought to reshape India's economic policies, governance structures, and international standing. During his first term, Modi implemented key economic reform and development initiatives, including the controversial demonetization of high-denomination currency notes to curb black money and corruption. His government introduced the Goods and Services Tax to unify India's sprawling indirect tax system into a streamlined framework. On the international front, Modi worked to elevate India's profile on the global stage, engaging closely with world leaders and advocating for stronger ties with both Western and Eastern powers. His efforts to boost foreign direct investment and enhance technological infrastructure have been significant, aiming to position India as a powerhouse in the digital age. Re-elected in 2019, Modi's leadership has continued amidst acclaim and controversy. His emphasis on national security, assertive foreign policy, and a Hindu nationalist agenda has sparked significant debate and division within the country. Under Modi's tenure, India has witnessed significant shifts in its approach to internal and external security challenges. Domestically, Modi's government has pursued policies that have intensified the focus on national security, integrating advanced technology and enhancing the operational capability of its security forces. However, these changes have also been accompanied by contentious political maneuvers, such as the implementation of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the revocation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir, which have sparked widespread debate and raised concerns about the erosion of democratic norms and civil liberties. These internal policy challenge the fabric of India's pluralistic society and question the balance between security measures and democratic freedoms. Regionally, Modi's tenure has redefined India's relationship with its neighbors and reshaped its role in South Asia. Long-standing tensions with Pakistan over Kashmir and cross-border terrorism persist, while the relationship with China becomes increasingly strained, particularly after the Galwan Valley clash in 2020. Challenges also exist with other neighbors like Nepal and Bangladesh over diplomatic disputes and issues related to border management and refugee flows. These regional dynamics are crucial as they influence India's approach to regional cooperation and conflict resolution and its ability to project power and maintain stability in its immediate neighborhood. Globally, Modi's India actively participates in international forums and has forged strategic partnerships, notably in the Quad, alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia, to counter Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. This alignment reflects India's broader strategy to safeguard its maritime interests and enhance its influence in ensuring a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. India's aspirations for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council reflect its ambitions to be a leading player in global governance. To delve deeper into these complex issues, we're fortunate to have Professor Shyam Tekwani with us today. His expertise in political violence, terrorism, media and conflict, and South Asian security dynamics will provide valuable insights into India's evolving political landscape and its implications for the region and the world. But let's get to it. Shyam, welcome back to the Security Nexus webinar.
Thank you, James, for having me back.
Oh my, our audience will remember your appearance here on episode 6, Power Play in South Asia. And so it's amazing, but 5 months have gone by since then.
Much has happened.
Much has happened. We began then talking about, it was in January, early January, talking about all the elections that were forthcoming. Well, here we are now into the results and the re-election of Modi. We're going to talk about that today. But before we do that, I wonder if you just might, for the audience, give us a little bit about your story. Tell us a little bit of your journey, how you came into this field.
Yeah, so I'll keep this short since I've already said it in the previous episode 6. I started off as a journalist working in South Asia, where I spent a fair amount of time covering all kinds of stories, including conflict, primarily in Sri Lanka, and then moved into academics. Took a break from journalism, went back to school, and found myself, and I stumbled into it. Spent 10 years in Singapore teaching at the university before moving here 15 years ago, and I focus here on South Asia, terrorism, media, as well as India.
You do, and you are a sought-after expert in this field. I think maybe we could talk a little bit about Indian election process and Modi's persona. Prime Minister Modi's leadership style has significantly influenced this electoral success, I would say. And so here's the question. I wonder if you can analyze the key elements of Modi's leadership that contributed to his re-election for a third term.
Right. So I don't know if success would be the way some people would see it. They see this is almost like a defeat and victory, primarily because at the outset, before the elections, the whole world assumed it was just going to be a walkover for Modi and his party, to the extent that Modi and his party were actually tom-tomming the fact that they were going to come back with an increased majority and looking at crossing over 400 seats.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen. What happened was worse.
Yeah.
He lost, his party lost the majority that they had won in 2019, to the extent that they came back, or they were re-elected without a simple majority to form a government on its own. So now they're reliant on a couple of smaller regional parties to be able to continue ruling the country. So in terms of persona, I think this was, I don't know, I should call it bizarre, but in the 40-odd scripted interactions that Modi had with a select group of pliable media, or we call them lapdogs. I mean, they call them lapdogs in India. There's a word for it, Godi media, which is lapdogs. 40 scripted interactions. He's never given a single interview. He's never held a single press conference. So in these scripted interactions, one of them, he actually declared that he was non-biologically born and that he was God sent. Like all of us are God sent, except in his case, he was non-biological. So we were looking at, that at one point it seemed like nobody could challenge that. But as it played out, his charisma or his mesmerizing power, which they often attribute to him, lost its sheen, didn't make it. And I think they got carried away by their own belief that they were going to do something spectacular in terms of numbers this time. Also, the fact that he inaugurated that huge temple in the north of India in Ayodhya. It was over the debris of a mosque that Hindu mobs had razed in 1992. It seemed that that temple was going to absolutely decide the fate of India for the next 5 years in terms of giving him and his party phenomenal numbers. Turns out there were more pressing issues for people than having a non-biological ruler and a temple. So I would say issues played a large part this time. Issues of inflation, unemployment, high price rises. And as we speak, a few other issues have actually stumbled out, partly to do with the education system in India, the way exams are conducted, etc. So I would say if he relied too much on his persona, he went to the extent of actually coining this slogan. It is all about Modi's guarantee. And he said, Modi guarantees this, Modi guarantees that. And if you looked at all the billboards and advertisements that came out, he occupied, if not the primary spot, the sole spot, and everybody else was out of the picture. So everything in this election revolved around his persona and his glib promises for the future, which we have seen since the emergence in 2014. There are always glib promises. Give me 5 years, give me 5 years. And now he's talking about 1,000-year reign, and this is what he's going to achieve in the next 1,000 years, etc. So I think the electorate woke up, the lived realities. They overcame whatever charisma he might have. So all to say that I suspect that they lost touch with reality, the BJP and he himself, at the outset, because and somewhere in the middle of the election, it was a long election, 6 weeks long, and in this in a summer, unprecedented summer, with heat waves, election officers falling dead because it was so hot, and all that stuff. So we saw voter percentage dropping. And I think they got wind of it by the second phase, that things were not going according to script. And then after that, we saw him and his party actually step up the anti-Muslim rhetoric, the polarizing issues, calling Bangladeshi infiltrators as opposed to termites before. So then when they got a sense of it was not going their way, no holds barred. They went after the minorities and the Muslims. Again, it didn't work out the way he planned it or the way he anticipated it. So that much about his personality and his campaigning style.
It's fascinating. I think for a little bit of scope, I mean, you said 6-week election went on for a long time, and probably somewhere around 600 million voters.
Yes, over 600 million voters.
And largely, if not exclusively, an electronic voting that easy to tabulate, but just the sheer scope of it all.
Well, there was controversy about those electronic machines too, and that's still being disputed. It's very controversial. It's being challenged. That you have a bunch of experts who will tell you can't manipulate these machines, but then equally on the other side, people think it can be manipulated. And again, more importantly, it was not a level playing field, because Modi had all the government agencies under his control, whether it's the pliable judiciary, whether it's the enforcement directorate, the income tax folks, the media, which is primarily the thing, and then freezing the opposition's accounts, jailing opponents without trial, without conviction, some of who are still languishing in prison, arresting two chief ministers. Then you also had expelling members of parliament from parliament so that he had free run of whatever policies or legislations he wanted to push through. And so it is remarkable that despite the fact that it was not a level playing field, that the opposition was able to unite and work on real issues, which would not have happened if these issues were not real.
Yeah.
I think that's important to remember. These are issues which, again, if you look at global media, one of the things that you often see is how remarkable India is. It's the fifth largest economy, or having overtaken Britain. It's going to be the third one in a few years from now, and by 2047, the 100th anniversary of India's independence, it's going to be a developed nation. All that's fine. But if you look at the underbelly, the story is very, very, very stark and different.
I want to pull on the domestic elements that you were speaking about. Without a doubt, Modi's domestic policies, particularly his economic reforms, his nationalist agenda, I mean, they've evoked praise and criticism. So maybe you can just elucidate a little bit of this and talk about the major achievements and the criticisms of these policies, and then predict a little bit forward into this term.
All right. So one thing that we often hear about is India is the fastest growing economy. GDP is great, 8.3%, etc. But something that everybody has to remember is it's not distributed equally. The level of inequality, the level of poverty is astounding. That's number one. And you mentioned earlier about his policies on demonetization in November 2016, and then he had the GST, and then after which we also had COVID. And all three had ripple and disastrous effects on another segment of economy, which we really don't factor into when we're making all these calculations about GDP, etc. And that's the unorganized sector, what we call the informal economy.
Yes.
I just saw a report recently where it says the combination of demonetization, very inefficient execution of the GST, as well as the pandemic, there's been a loss of 1.8 million enterprises. And these are called micro, small, medium enterprises. They're not registered, etc., but they're all small. And these basically are the mainstay of the economy, have been the mainstay. We lost 1.8 million enterprises, and we're looking at 5.4 million jobs. And this is a non-farming sector. Farming sector is different. We saw the farmers' protests, etc. So, which is to say, demonetization, and you mentioned it too, it was ostensibly to rid corruption.
Right.
Did it rid corruption? Absolutely not. I think we're seeing corruption at very different levels now. Skeletons are beginning to tumble out right now, and they're going to see more of that because you have a very spirited opposition. Finally, after 10 years, you're going to have a leader of the opposition party. So you can expect more of that. So then, I mean, if you look at what he tried to do with farmers, he brought in some laws which he had to roll back because of protests. Now, you have a bunch of experts who will tell you, and I think I tend to agree with that. The farm laws he was trying to push through have merit, and I think they're for the larger good. But the way he went about it, it was absolutely divisive. There was no consultation, no consensus, etc. So it's in a way, whatever policies, economic policies is enunciated, the intent might have been right, whether it's GST, demonetization. I don't think there's any living soul on this planet who's going to agree that it was a right move or a wise move. I think it was more politically loaded there.
And the GST, that was a bit of a simplified tax basis.
Absolutely. Across the country, and the states have their own, etc. It was executed very poorly, and it caused a lot of grief and continues to. And we're seeing that the debris of that even now in terms of unemployment, etc.
Interesting. I want to go ahead.
If I may.
Yeah. That's
when we talk about all these policies, the people who support these will often point data to you to basically corroborate their thesis. But let's face one fact: when it comes to data, I think it's a truism. If you torture data enough, it'll confess to whatever you want it to confess. And I think if you look at the data which is actually coming, and the problem with the government data is it's not credible. The fact that they've been fudging, the fact that they've been holding back information, there's no credibility in whatever they say. But on the other hand, when you find independent researchers putting out data, there's far more, at least on balance, there's more credibility there than what the government is putting out. That's one. We've not had a national census. The last one was in 2011. The next one was to be in 2021. And the government's response was, we can't do it because of COVID. But the truth is, 143 countries conducted the census after COVID.
The United States did.
143 countries.
Yeah, I said the United States was one of them, yeah.
And BRICS, if you look at the BRICS countries, India is the only one that's not conducted the census. So they're very, very cagey about numbers for a number of reasons. And so there is no credibility, and it's very hard to see any credibility in the numbers that they dole out, that the government doles out.
Your comments about numbers reminds me of the old adage, figures lie and liars figure.
Oh, yes. Very true. Very true.
Let me pull us up a little bit and talk about regional implications to this. And so recent tensions, including the boundary disputes with Nepal over the area of Lipayada, Hura, Kalapani, Lipulek, that's a mouthful, with China over the line of actual control and Pakistan over the Karakoram region, as well as Kashmir. I mean, these have highlighted challenges in India's foreign relations under Modi's muscular foreign policy. So here's a question then, Shyam. How have these policies influenced India's relationship with its neighboring countries like Nepal, China, and Pakistan? And what regional dynamics can we expect in this third term?
Well, you left out Maldives.
True.
But
that's a
that's a big one.
But you can pull on that one as well.
Yeah. So the one with Nepal, it's been long-standing and not been long-standing, in the sense it goes back many decades. And from the Nepal's perspective, it was an issue that needed to be addressed. And India at various points in its history said, we'll address it if you have evidence forthcoming. And from Nepal's side, they feel that they have enough evidence to prove that it belongs to them, and that's the way it should be. But strictly speaking, for the last 60 years, India has administered these places.
Yeah.
You know, people pay taxes and all that stuff, which is not to say that Nepal's claims are incredible. Point being, it all started when the defense minister, they constructed a road on one of these areas. It's a tri-junction of China, India, and Nepal.
Yeah.
It was a 50-mile long road. I think that was way back in 2019 or something. And this was almost after India revoked the autonomy of Kashmir. And from India's perspective, that's a very strategic location, especially given the experience it had in 1962 with China. Very bad defeat. So from India's perspective, it's very important strategically. And trade and transit would be easier. And equally important, Hindu pilgrims use that to go to Mount Kailash every year. It's big. So that didn't go down well in Nepal, primarily because there was hardly any consultation. It was just done. And so Nepal was a bit annoyed. And then we have to remember, we keep referring to India in religious nationalist terms in the last 10 years, and rightfully so. What we should not lose sight of, and most of us tend to do that, is that there are correspondingly nationalist feelings and aspirations and movements among India's neighbors too, not necessarily religiously based. And we tend to lose sight of that. So obviously it offended nationalist sentiment in Nepal that India could go ahead and build this road. And the issue came to the fore again. The cabinet in Nepal met and said they were going to reissue a map of Nepal to show that these areas actually belong to Nepal, which the cabinet approved. The map was out. India's turn to get infuriated, and it's been going on. And until early this year, the cabinet again decided they were going to bring out a 100 rupee currency note with the map of Nepal redrawn to include these three areas, which India
in the northwest area.
In the northwest, abutting Uttarakhand. The state province is called Uttarakhand. So now this is not something India is going to give up easily, and this is not something Nepal can afford to give up easily now, because it's become an issue right down to the, to the street. And we have to bear in mind, it would be very hard for Nepal to make any concessions. If it were to decide it wants to make concessions, I don't see why it would, simply because it has had a very bad, let's say, relations with India since 2015, I would say. When nobody in India wants to hear this, that they appear as a bully in the region. Nobody wants to see it. Often they retort with, oh, we have done this for them, we have did this for them, how can they be ungrateful? I think just that very thought, how can they be ungrateful, is telling that you should think they're ungrateful. So the point is, when India put into force an economic blockade of Nepal in 2014, simply because Nepal's constitution wasn't to India's liking. Since then, its temperatures have not been good. I mean, the relationships has not been good, and we see increasing Chinese influence as a result of that in Nepal. Having said that, Nepal, much like Maldives or Sri Lanka, and I'll talk about Maldives in a minute, they recognize that it's going to be hard living without getting some support from India. And India also needs these countries for strategic reasons. And so it works both ways. So they'll have these spats. But when it comes to these three areas near Kalapani, then I just have a feeling it's going to go the Kashmir way, in the sense we're not going to see a resolution to it as easily as it could have been had not India, really rubbed Nepal the wrong side repeatedly in recent years. So I think that's going to be a long lingering issue. With Pakistan, they're not even on talking terms. SAARC is not, convened. And from India's point of view, it's just hung up. It's just focused on this terrorism business, when there are other large issues to be considered, even whether it's improving trade and transit. Everything is on standby till Pakistan, from India's perspective, disbands its terror outfits that apparently are working against Indian interests. That's Pakistan for you. With China, it's not going to go away. It's, again, a problem that India will have to learn to live with. And to what degree, you can have a government like Modi's, which is bombastic and says China has not taken any territory from us, but you can't live that life for a very long time. It's sooner or later, it's going to emerge. But in terms of strategic concerns, I don't think that's a conflict. That's not a situation that's going to go away. With China, it goes back decades. It's just resurfaced recently, and now the Chinese are not going to budge, and India has but little choice except to live with it. I don't see much happening in that direction. With Maldives, again, like Nepal had an India out movement, Bangladesh in recent months, we're beginning to witness an undercurrent, not witness, the undercurrent has always been there, but we're witnessing a upsurge of that India out, anti-India sentiment. Sri Lanka's had it historically since the 80s, comes and goes. With the Maldives, it really surfaced very strongly with the election of the new president in November last year. He came on an India out plank, and one of his earliest poll promises, which he delivered on, was to get Indian troops out of the country. And now you hear, when you look at the Indian media, even as of yesterday, so when Modi was when he was sworn in the third time, he again invited all the prime ministers, heads of states of the neighboring countries, except if Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Maldivian president made an appearance. And so that was seen as a signal that Maldives also realizes, I mean, you got to have a working relationship. You don't have to love them, but you got to have a work. India needs Maldives as much as Maldives needs India. But if you look at the even editorials, forget editorials, even strategic community, the way they talk about the whole thing is like, Maldives is waking up to the reality. They can't be without us. Always ignoring the fact that India needs the Maldives no less than it does Sri Lanka or Bangladesh for its own strategic purposes. So I think these are conflicts which are not going to go away. I mean, or if you want to call it differences, not necessarily conflicts. And all the neighboring countries, whether it's Maldives, whether it is Bangladesh, or whether it is Nepal, they recognize now they have a leverage. India's strategic concerns are a leverage for these small countries. It's given them a little more agency to be able to hold off instead of buckling and giving in. The last point I want to make is during the election campaign, the Modi government, at least the Modi party, BJP, they raised an issue of an island called Kachativu, which under a treaty, India acknowledged that it belonged to Sri Lanka. I'm talking about 1976. So during the campaign year, Modi and company made that an issue of how we actually gave it away. We're going to take it back. So it's a domestic, obviously it was a domestic ploy to, get the voters agitated about the previous government selling out India's real estate. But it has an impact on these countries. You think the Sri Lankans were happy hearing that this guy is promising that he's going to retrieve the island from us? So I just think in the desperation to win the election, they flail about a bit. They did flail, and impact on countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are going to be long lasting.
Listening to you reminded me of the absolute master class you gave, as it were, on the regional dynamics in our earlier episode that I spoke about. You used the acronym IDEAL, and you just talked about the many tortured challenges in the region. And we won't go further, but I mean, they've got challenges with Myanmar and with that neighbor and others. And so your regional dynamics matter because you live where you're in the neighborhood you're in, and it has a huge impact on where you put your energy and how much effort you have to invest. Maybe we take this to the international implications now of this third term. And we spoke earlier, I mean, without a doubt, Modi is seen as this counter with China and their growing influence, as it were. So maybe let me ask you this. How might Modi's third term affect India's strategic partnerships and its global perception? But then I'm also thinking, with regards to human rights and democratic values as well. And so there's a lot tied in that question, I think.
Well, I don't think they're going to go off script with in terms of building strategic relationships and international partnerships. That's going to continue. And let's face it, in the last 10 years, there's been nothing really significantly new that previous governments have not sought, except the pace has accelerated. There's assertiveness, there's a little more confidence. And I think that confidence obviously springs from the fact that there is a recognition that the whole world looks to India as a bulwark against a rising neighbor, a big neighbor called China. And then, of course, the economy and big markets, et cetera, which I think more and more people are beginning to realize it's not really as rosy as it looks. The fact that there's been a 43% drop in foreign direct investment into India, that's telling. That the fact that people are spending less on consumption, consuming less, or investing less, that's telling. So, I mean, the cracks are beginning to show in that rosy image of India being as the ultimate destination for growth and all that stuff. So I think as far as foreign policy goes, we're going to see more of the same. I don't see any of that changing. And as long as India is perceived as a strategic uh, 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 partner, or even a strategic
Counter against China? Counter against China?
Yeah, a counter against China. Modi or anybody in the BJP who comes after Modi will continue to do what they're doing domestically, because the whole world is turning a blind eye to what goes on. Human rights, democracy, they are just lip service. They're just words to a large degree, simply because he knows, at least India knows, recognizes the fact that up to a point they can do what they want, and which is what they've been doing. I mentioned earlier the backsliding of democracy, imprisoning dissidents or opponents without conviction, without trial. That's continuing. One thought that this drubbing in the elections was going to change the Modi government's approach to dealing with the minorities. Surprise. It's actually picked up after the elections. We've witnessed a number of lynchings in the last few days and attacks on Muslims, bulldozing their houses and what have you. So none of that. And that's probably him sending a message, or the party sending a message. Just because we are low in numbers does not mean that's going to impede our path to reworking Indian society according to the Hindutva ideology. That could be the message that's coming out. Now, to what extent the opposition parties, to what extent the international community might desire to step in and say enough is enough. You can't expect to be a great power if you treat your own people or your own minorities, 200 million people, this way. I'm afraid this is not going to slow down or stop. And I think, honestly, unless there is some degree of international intervention, I don't use the word intervention, nobody likes it, but as long as there's some degree of international concern, which you can see in action, whether in terms of sanctions, whether in terms of decreasing support at any level, this sort of thing is going to continue.
I was a security practitioner through the last decade of the Cold War, before Soviet Union fell in '91, and so all of the '80s. And I was reminded of, during those years, in many places around the world, democracy and democratic values took a second place to the Cold War mentality and trying to shore up sides and stuff. And to listen to you talk about that makes me think about how we have a bit of a Back to the Future moment, where priorities are other places, perhaps. Let's talk about a futurist view. When you think about Modi's next 5 years, he's perhaps poised to take on a number of strategic initiatives. And so I'd ask you, what is this next 5 or 10, or you said earlier 1,000 years, but what does it look like? And India's had long-serving prime ministers before that made some significant impact. Perhaps Nehru and Indira Gandhi were long-serving prime ministers as well. So when you think of the future, how do you see this?
Well, number one, there's a stark difference between the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, and then his daughter, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. They were elected thrice. Okay.
They were.
Stark difference. They didn't lose their simple majority. They had majority. In his case, he's lost his majority.
It'll be harder to govern.
It should be harder to govern because you have an opposition now. So that's number one. Number two, I am not confident he will last 5 years. I'm not confident this party, this BJP, this government will last, this regime will last for 5 full years.
Okay.
Because of the compulsions and contradictions of coalition, etc. And also a strengthened, a revitalized opposition. I'm not confident that he's going to make it through a 5-year term. So I think his top priority, the way I see it, as I said earlier, the international and strategic partnerships and foreign policy is going to go on as it is. It may slacken some pace, primarily because he's going to be too preoccupied with what I think is his immediate and I think urgent priority, which is the Hindutva ideology, which is remake Indian society. I think he's going to be focusing more attention on that and leave foreign policy to a large part to his very able foreign minister.
Say a little bit more about Hindutva. We haven't brought that up yet in this episode, so there'll be people who are less familiar with.
Yeah, I think the first thing people should be mindful of is there's a difference between Hinduism and Hindutva. Hinduism is the religion which 80% of the population subscribes to. Hindutva is the use of Hinduism as a political vehicle for a political ideology, which is essentially to create a monolithic, monochromatic society of Hindus only, primarily. And suggestions to that, you're looking at the rewriting of history textbooks, where they're just eliminating huge chunks of history. It was very funny. Recently, one of the guys who was in charge of, I think he's a minister, he said, we want to remove all these aspects of history because we don't want our future generations to be depressed reading about war and conflict and what societies have been to. I mean, bizarre. Anyway, so that's going to be, I think the energy is going to be on that project to make sure that future generations are brainwashed, and what we're witnessing now is you have a generation of folks in the last 10 years who see vigilantism and vandalism as a righteous aspect of their religion. So I think his focus is primarily going to be on the Hindutva angle.
I want to pull on that more as we transition to audience questions. I know, and we've got several. We won't make it through all of them, but let's start with this one because it pulls from what you were just talking about. That's the interfaith relations. And so, the question is, has there been any significant change in attitudes towards Muslims in India, or is the sentiment expected to persist? Now, I think you've kind of opened up with the response, but I'll give you a chance to talk more on this.
Well, I think just to go back a bit, I don't want to make it sound like there's always been amity between both the communities. Given the after effects of partition in 1947 when the subcontinent was split, the Muslims went to Pakistan and the Hindus stayed back here, and there was migration of people where millions of people got displaced and killed. So we've always had pockets of Hindu-Muslim tensions, but this one is very different. In the last 10 years, it's very different. It is almost like as if it was state-sanctioned. It's almost like it's no more, someone pointed this out earlier, it's no more excluding Muslims and minorities from opportunities and jobs and education. And now it seems more like they're proactively keeping them out, whether it's through legislation, whether it's through lynchings, whether it's through violence. That's very different in the last 10 years. It's almost like one would say, if you want to be kind, the state is a passive onlooker. If you want to be unkind, you can say the state is tacitly supporting it. So I think it's unless it's going to take a combination of factors to reverse that, or at least, if not reverse it completely, at least to halt the degree to which it is going. And that'll be not just the opposition parties, but I think to a certain degree, you still need an international oversight on this. So frankly speaking, it's getting bleaker for the Muslims. If last 10 years were hell, it's going to be even more hellish now.
Okay, let's go to the next question, which is on neighborhood first policy. I think that policy originally came out in 2008. But the question is this: will India's neighborhood first policy remain a priority for the current government, especially regarding defense and security?
Well, from the government's perspective, it's always priority number one. And no, I mean, Modi started that neighborhood policy when he first came. Neighborhood first. 2014 he's elected. He calls all the the prime ministers of all the neighboring countries for his swearing in. And as I said earlier, a lot of us thought that was a masterstroke. That was a great way of building relations. This was 2014, summer of 2014. And what does he do next year? He effects an embargo. I mean, India and Nepal relations go downhill. Okay. And since then, whether it is with Maldives or to some degree with Sri Lanka and in some aspects, or the way they've been calling names to Bangladeshi refugees, on paper, you don't see. In fact, you don't see much of that translating, the neighborhood first policy translating into real action. I think the way they seem to be looking at neighborhood first policies, okay, you need a first responder, you have a disaster, we'll come and help you. Or you've had an avalanche, we're sending you some money and aid. I think what they fail to understand, it's not about material aid alone, it's also about giving respect, mutual respect, respecting the fact that they also have feelings of nationalism. You don't sit there and tell them, here's money. You have a problem, here's money. And you're not giving money out of the largest of your heart. You're giving money just because nobody else comes and gives them the money and wins their favor. So I think neighborhood first will always remain a priority on paper, as a lip service, but in reality, you don't see that translate much beyond, as I said, aid and materials.
The next question asks about diplomatic strategies, and it's really asking about the Look East policy and how it's currently being implemented. So maybe you talk a little bit about that.
So it used to be Look East till Modi changed it to Act East. And Act East, which was essentially to originally when it was conceived, the Look East policy, that was in 2009, I believe. The idea was to connect India's Northeast to Southeast Asia and trade, connectivity, etc. And then he made it Act East because it was going to be a little more vigorous and rigorous. We are seeing some of that happen. His Act East has, I'd like to highlight especially the growing India-Philippines relationship. It's growing by leaps and bounds, to the extent that India was able to sell its missiles to Philippines, the BrahMos missiles. And very recently, we had the Philippines essentially singing hosannas to the relationship. And it won't be a surprise if we see a Marcos Modi summit this year, sooner than later. And in terms of other countries, Vietnam, Singapore, relationships are getting more robust. Indonesia, you see a lot of effort in that direction as far as Act East goes. But it's the neighborhood first, which is always suffering.
Okay. This next question is asking about regional leadership. And so the question is India prepared to lead SAARC, that's South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, right? Aiming to synchronize policies in South Asian geopolitics and foster closer relations among its member states. Maybe talk about SAARC.
Yeah, sure. SAARC has, I think it came to existence in 1985 or 87, thereabouts. It's marked more by its inability to achieve its intended goals, regional cooperation, improving trade, etc. Primarily because it's held hostage to the India-Pakistan dynamic. They haven't convened for a long time now, simply because India doesn't want, and if India says, I'm not going to be part of SAARC, then some of the neighbors want to show support, like Bhutan, Sri Lanka to some degree. And so that organization is in limbo at this point. But even when it's not in limbo, it hasn't shown much. It hasn't delivered as much as ASEAN, right, in Southeast Asia. India assuming leadership, Really, it won't matter because as long as Pakistan is still a part of it, I don't see India wanting to take leadership of such an organization. India is more prone to having bilateral conversations or minilaterals within the region. But I don't see India. It's not that India says we don't want SARC. It's not that Pakistan says we don't want SARC. Everybody says we want SARC. We want it to, kickstart again from where it is. But that's not going to happen as long as India and Pakistan don't see eye to eye on even what to disagree or what to agree.
The next question is asking us about geopolitical challenges. Can India effectively address international security and geopolitical dilemmas, particularly when diplomacy seems passive?
Well, if you looked at supporters of Modi, they would say yes, because there's been a claim that he was able to stop the Ukrainians from fighting with the Russians for a day to evict Indian citizens from there. And it's become part of the mythology there that Modi actually stopped the war. He was able to influence it to get Indians out. But I think it would really, I think India's power is very limited there. It's very limited in terms of being able to, as I understand your question, in terms of being able to bring about ceasefires and contain conflicts. I doubt it. I think at this point in time, it's to India's advantage. What's happening in Ukraine and the US sanctions, it's able to get its oil cheap from Russia. And so unless India's interests are directly affected by some international event, I do not see. And even then, even if India were to try and step up to influence the course of that particular dilemma or situation, I think it has very limited power, very limited. There's more rhetorical flourish coming out of India than actual abilities.
I think we'll take one more audience question, and this one will be on balancing global relationships. And so the question is, how can India continue to develop its relationship with Western G7 countries while remaining an active member of BRICS? And that's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Actually, there's several more, but countries that are now members of it, but the BRICS intergovernmental organization.
Well, to give credit to India's foreign minister, he's been able to achieve all this. I mean, it's not a difficult thing for him. It's not even where it seems contradictory. He's been able to pull off relationships which seemingly would be at odds with all the other relationships that India is developing. So I don't see much of an issue there at all. The fact that they're walking a fine balance between the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Russia and Ukraine with Iran, and then also India's thrust towards the India, was it India, Middle East, Europe corridor?
That's right.
That's in deep freeze right now, given the outbreak of conflict there. So I don't see India having issues being able to successfully navigate through a myriad number of relationships, which on the face of it look contradictory. India is a past master at living with two contradictory thoughts in their head. I mean, they're able to do it. And I think that comes from years of being a non-aligned country and its attempt to be strategically autonomous. And he's declared his intent clearly. It's India's interests first. And so even if partnerships and relationships look contradictory from India's perspective, they're not. And they're able to actually rationalize and justify each one of them quite convincingly for the others to take it on board.
Well, it's been fascinating. I have greatly enjoyed this time together. But before we let you go, I always like to ask our guests to recommend books for the audience. And so maybe you might do that for us.
Well, I would. I know I was expected to recommend one book, but if you allow me,
I will allow. Please.
I've got a quartet. I've got 4 books.
4 it is.
And I think they're very, very important for anybody who really wants to understand.
And we'll make sure we'll put this on the show notes and on the webpage so people can refer to them. But please tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so this book is called Unequal, It's by Swati Narayan. This essentially talks about why India lags behind its neighbors. Why is Bangladesh doing better? Why is Nepal doing better across certain indices? And I think this is a very important book everyone should read to understand India's position in the region. The other one is called Whole Numbers and Half-Truths. It's by Rukmini S. And this is about what data can and cannot tell us about modern India. I think this is very valuable, especially given the fact that I mentioned earlier, figures and data coming out of the government of India are very hard to, they lack the credibility that such numbers should have, primarily because of India's, at least not, I won't say India, but at least because of the Modi regime's proclivity to control these numbers and delay their release, etc. The third book is again a marvelous book. It's called Shades of Saffron by Sabah Naqvi. This is a great book if you want to understand the rise of the BJP and its parent organization, the RSS, in India today and how it impacts everything that's going on in India today. The fourth one is called Midnight's Borders. It's by Suchitra Vijayan. And she spent 7 years, 7 long years across the 6 international borders of India. That includes Bhutan, China, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, I'm missing out a country, Pakistan. And these are on the ground. These are narrative reportages. Now, what is fascinating about all these 4 books is the fact that these are not works that have come out out of airy-fairy ivory towers. I mean, these are all all people who have gone to the ground, who have worked on the ground, spoken to people. So these are, you could call them narrative reportages, but backed by solid academic analysis. It's rigorous. And if you read these 4 books, I think you'll have a solid grip and understanding of what exactly is happening in India, whether it's domestic policies, whether it's the issue of Muslims, whether it's the economy, whether it's India's relations with its neighbors.
I have read not those books. You've recommended many other books to me before, and I've read many. And so you are a great source of literature to understand the region. I might note, if I caught that right, all 4 of those authors are women.
Oh, all 4 of the authors are women. Yes, you're right.
And colleagues amongst those groups?
Yeah, I have a former colleague, Sabah Naqvi, who wrote this book, Shades of Saffron. There's a revised and updated edition that came out this year. I think it's very, very important for you to read this if you want to understand the BJP and the RSS. She basically is recording the growth of the organization in today's politics.
Shyam, our time together has been absolutely masterful. Your experience, your understanding of the region of the country is very tight. Thank you for what you've brought here today. Thank you for engaging with with our audience as well.
Well, thank you very much, James, for giving me this chance to be back again.
Oh.
It's always a pleasure talking with you off and on camera.
It is my pleasure, actually. And so with that, thank you. So as we wrap up, remember that informed communities are resilient. Today's discussion with Professor Shyam Tekwani underscored the complexities of India's strategic position in this dynamic region, highlighting the need for continued vigilance and strategic adaptability in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I encourage you to join us on July 8th for our next Security Nexus webinar, From Promises to Reality, Analyzing the 2024 India Elections, featuring Dr. Srini Sitaraman. Now, this session will explore the intricate governance challenges in India, the dynamics of internal politics, the rise of welfarism and freebie politics, and the pervasive impact of disinformation. Now, we'll discuss how these factors shape India's political landscape and their implications for democratic processes in the region. From all of us here at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, thank you for being a part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha oi. As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.